Lovecraft wrote as a man of the early 20th century, formed by industrial modernity and scientific disillusion. Born in 1890 and writing most of his major work between 1917 and 1936, he rejected religious belief with unusual consistency. According to his letters, especially those from the 1920s, the universe was governed by indifferent laws rather than moral purpose. Gods for him were narrative instruments, not objects of faith. This matters because it explains a crucial tension in his work. He filled his stories with deities, yet treated divinity as a mistake humans make when faced with scale. The unnamed God emerges from this tension. It is not a lapse in imagination, but a boundary he refused to cross. Lovecraft's intellectual background clarifies that refusal. He read Lucretius, admired Haeckel, and absorbed late Victorian materialism. At the same time, he was surrounded by older metaphysical systems that assumed a hidden source behind reality. Gnostic traditions spoke of a god beyond gods. Neoplatonism placed the one above all description. Eastern philosophies described ultimate reality as formless and inaccessible. Lovecraft did not accept these systems, but he understood their structure. Consider this carefully. He borrowed their architecture without their hope. The result is a cosmos where something may exist beyond comprehension, not as salvation, but as structural excess. Language itself becomes evidence. Lovecraft's invented names rely on harsh consonants, broken rhythm, and phonetic instability. They suggest limits of pronunciation rather than meaning. Yet the most important figure receives no name at all. This is not because it is sacred, but because naming implies containment. Here we see a key move, not mystery as ornament, but mystery as constraint. The silence functions symbolically. It marks a point where language fails before belief can begin. In several stories, narrators approach this limit and retreat into vagueness, ellipsis, or contradiction. The absence is doing the work. Lovecraft's myth-building depends on this strategy. He constructed false texts, lost cults, and fragmentary histories to imitate real mythic traditions. Authentic myths, after all, are incomplete. They survive as ruins. By leaving a central god unexplained, Lovecraft replicated that condition. The mythos feels ancient because it is damaged. We must pause here. This technique creates authority through omission. What is missing feels older than what is present. The reader senses a depth that cannot be reached, only circled. That sensation is essential to the effect. His correspondence confirms this approach. In letters to Clark Ashton Smith and others during the early 1930s, Lovecraft resisted systematization. He warned against tidy hierarchies and moral oppositions. Later writers would impose order, but Lovecraft avoided it. He preferred loose suggestion, overlapping hints, and unresolved scale. The unnamed God fits this preference. It stabilizes nothing. Instead, it destabilizes all other entities by implication. If something exists beyond them, then their apparent enormity collapses. The horror expands outward rather than upward. Comparisons sharpen the point. Unlike Milton's God, whose power is absolute yet narratable, or the biblical Yahweh, who speaks and commands, Lovecraft's absent God does nothing visible. It does not intervene. It does not judge. It simply renders explanation inadequate. Three elements define this role: absence, implication, and scale. Together, they transform cosmic horror from spectacle into philosophy. The fear is not punishment, but meaninglessness under pressure. This prepares the ground for the next step. Once a god cannot be named, its nature must be inferred indirectly. Themes begin to matter more than figures. Insignificance, entropy, and unstable reality take center stage. What follows is not theology, but consequence. How such an absence reshapes thought, sanity, and the limits of knowledge itself. The intellectual climate Lovecraft inherited was already crowded with hidden gods. Long before his birth in 1890, Western philosophy had developed methods for speaking about what could not be spoken. Gnostic sects of the 2nd and 3rd centuries proposed a remote source beyond the false creator of the material world. Neoplatonism, especially in Plotinus around the 3rd century, described the one as prior to being, beyond attributes, and accessible only through negation. These systems treated absence as evidence. Lovecraft encountered them not as beliefs, but as conceptual machines. He understood how an unseen source could structure an entire worldview without ever appearing. At the same time, 19th century pessimism reshaped these older ideas. Thinkers like Schopenhauer replaced divine purpose with blind will. Later writers stripped even that away, leaving impersonal force. Lovecraft absorbed this shift through popular science and philosophical essays circulating in the late Victorian period. According to his essays, the universe was mechanical, yet disturbingly vast. Here lies a key inheritance. Traditional metaphysics asked what lies behind reality. Modern materialism asked whether anything does. Lovecraft fused the questions without resolving them. The result is not faith, but a permanent tension between explanation and void. We must pause here because this fusion is unusual. Lovecraft did not revive religion. He hollowed it out. Consider how apophatic theology works. In medieval Christian thought, God is described by what he is not. Lovecraft mirrors this structure while removing transcendence. The unnamed God becomes not holy, but inaccessible, not merciful, but irrelevant. This reveals something profound. The form of theology survives even after belief collapses. Structure outlives meaning. Comparisons clarify the point. In Hindu philosophy, Brahman underlies all phenomena, yet remains impersonal and indescribable. In Taoism, the Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. These traditions use restraint to protect truth. Lovecraft uses restraint to suggest danger. The similarity is structural, not spiritual. He adopts the grammar of ineffability while rejecting its consolation. The reader senses something ultimate, but receives no promise of harmony or release. Literary influences reinforce this pattern. Arthur Machen's concept of hidden worlds and Algernon Blackwood's emphasis on unseen presences shaped Lovecraft's imagination during the 1910s. Yet both writers allowed glimpses of meaning or unity. Lovecraft closed that door. His hidden God does not unify. It fragments. The more one approaches it, the less coherence remains. This is not mysticism, but anti-mysticism wearing familiar clothing. The cultural moment matters. After World War I, confidence in progress collapsed. Scientific advancement had not prevented mass death. Lovecraft wrote during this aftermath, particularly in the 1920s. His cosmic vision reflects a world where systems fail silently. The absent God mirrors this historical disillusion. Power exists, but it offers no explanation. Authority persists without justification. That idea resonated because it already described modern life. Triadic patterns emerge across these antecedents. First, a hidden source is assumed. Second, language fails to reach it. Third, human meaning erodes under that failure. Lovecraft did not invent this sequence. He stripped it of redemption. Not mystery leading to insight, but mystery leading to collapse. This distinction defines his contribution to cosmic horror. These influences prepare us for a closer look at how language itself carries this burden. If philosophy provides the structure, words must enforce its limits. The next step is to examine how naming, sound, and silence become tools for suggesting what cannot and must not be fully articulated. In Lovecraft's cosmos, names do not clarify, they disturb. His most iconic entities bear names that resemble language but resist meaning. Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath. These are not labels in the traditional sense. They function as sound structures meant to disorient. Phonetic analysis reveals jagged consonant clusters, unnatural rhythms, and linguistic patterns that fracture rather than unify. The effect is intentional. By destabilizing language, Lovecraft undermines the reader's default assumptions about classification and understanding. But the most potent disruption lies not in what is named, but in what remains unnamed. This silence is structural. To name something is to fix it within a system. Lovecraft avoids this when describing the most obscure figure, the god beyond even the outer gods. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, for instance, the ruling deity of the dreamlands is never described. Its name is never spoken. The language falters not due to ignorance, but because speech itself becomes inadequate. Naming implies containment. Silence gestures toward uncontainability. Here, Lovecraft inverts the logic of language. Instead of names producing power, power is measured by its resistance to naming. We must pause here and consider the implications. If gods like Azathoth can be named, however partially, then their limits, however unknowable, are at least suggested. The unnamed god represents something else entirely, a category that breaks the entire system. It is not simply ineffable, but unclassifiable. This distinction matters. The ineffable resists articulation. The unclassifiable resists existence as a concept. Lovecraft's avoidance of even a placeholder name introduces ontological instability. The being he never describes does not sit at the top of a hierarchy. It disrupts the very idea of hierarchy. Symbolic language fails alongside literal language. Lovecraft's work often uses metaphor to allude to unknowable realities, darkness, depth, vastness. But with this god, even metaphor recedes. There is no veil, no abyss, no gate. What remains is gestural, broken references, ellipses, or characters refusing to describe what they have glimpsed. In The Whisperer in Darkness, characters speak around the thing. In The Haunter of the Dark, the presence remains out of reach, perceptible only through intermediaries. The trapezohedron shows much, but not that. These linguistic evasions become the very proof of presence. Comparisons clarify how radical this strategy is. In traditional religious texts, the unspeakable name of God, Tetragrammaton, or YHWH, implies holiness. In contrast, Lovecraft's unspoken God implies danger. In Egyptian myth, secret names protected magical authority. In Lovecraft, the absence of a name signals ontological rupture. His linguistic choices do not mask truth. They reveal its impossibility. The absence is not decorative. It is foundational. Even constructed texts like the Necronomicon follow this pattern. Supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, it references many gods directly. But in scattered lines and marginal phrases, it gestures toward a power unnamed and unapproachable. That which the book cannot name is more feared than what it reveals. This paradox is crucial. The more central a being is, the less it is spoken. Knowledge in this schema does not accumulate. It disintegrates at the core. This logic reflects a deeper philosophical claim. The closer language comes to the real, the more it fails. The God Lovecraft never explains does not merely defy description, it weaponizes its absence. The next section will explore how this absence creates authenticity, how myth builds itself through what it leaves unsaid, and how, in Lovecraft's mythos, the missing becomes more powerful than the seen. Lovecraft's mythos gains its strange authority not through exposition, but through omission. What feels ancient in his stories is often what is missing. Fragments, contradictions, and gaps that mimic the erosion of real-world myth. This was no accident. Lovecraft deliberately constructed his narratives to resemble recovered ruins, partial inscriptions, lost civilizations, untranslated scripts. His world-building strategy was not to present a complete pantheon, but to create the illusion of one with missing parts. The most crucial of these absences is the god he never named. Its silence functions as an anchor, drawing all other elements into orbit around what cannot be seen. This is how myth-building works when belief is no longer possible. Traditional religions use narrative coherence to generate authority. Origin myths, divine genealogies, cosmic battles. Lovecraft inverts this. His stories suggest forgotten battles, unrecorded lineages, and origins that dissolve upon inspection. When Randolph Carter seeks the gods of dream in the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he finds only hints and avoidance. The gods are said to dwell in the cold waste, but no one knows who they are. The city they abandoned, Kadath, is unreachable. At the center, something waits, but nothing is revealed. The myth gestures backward into itself, generating gravity through unknowing. Consider this carefully. By leaving his central god unvoiced, Lovecraft created a gravitational void that holds the rest of his mythos in place. This absence becomes the guarantor of authenticity. Just as real ancient texts are incomplete, damaged by time, politics, or translation, so too is the mythos marked by its silences. These silences feel earned. The reader begins to sense a reality that cannot be fully accessed, only inferred through loss. The result is a myth that behaves like memory, unreliable, partial, and deeply convincing. Later collaborators struggled with this technique. August Derleth, for example, attempted to codify the mythos into a structured theology of good versus evil, what he called the elder gods versus the outer gods. In doing so, he collapsed the ambiguity Lovecraft had preserved. The unnamed god became, in these expansions, just another player in a cosmic struggle. But Lovecraft's original design resisted such clarity. He preferred overlapping traditions, conflicting reports, and texts that disagreed. Authenticity emerged from the lack of resolution. The fictional Necronomicon exemplifies this method. Supposedly a blasphemous volume, it is frequently cited, but never quoted in full. Characters report fragments, paraphrase passages, or speak of its contents secondhand. In this way, the book behaves like a religious relic, one whose power lies in what it refuses to disclose. When it gestures toward an unnamed god, greater than Azathoth, outside even the outer void, it does so obliquely. These half-mentions become more potent than full descriptions. They activate a sense of history precisely by leaving something out. This technique mimics real-world apocrypha. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas or the Book of Enoch gained mythic weight because they were hidden, excluded, or damaged. Their absence from canon made them alluring. Lovecraft applied the same logic to the mythology he invented. What is absent is not marginal. it becomes the center. The unnamed god is not a forgotten figure. It is the structural heart of the mythos, visible only by its gravitational pull. What follows is not mere storytelling, but a transformation of absence into metaphysical force. The god Lovecraft never explained does not require a name to haunt the narrative. Its silence is the method, its non-description is the signal, and its power lies in the way it destabilizes everything else. From here, we must examine what this god represents, not in theology, but in philosophy. What does it mean to build a universe around something that refuses meaning? In the next section, we will look at how this absent presence reshapes ideas of truth, madness, and reality itself. Lovecraft's horror begins with a simple proposition. The human mind evolved to function within narrow limits. What lies beyond those limits is not divine truth, but a kind of noise, too vast, too complex, too indifferent to sustain coherence. The unnamed god is the purest expression of this idea. It embodies not malevolence, but total illegibility. The result is not suffering in the traditional sense, but cognitive disintegration. This is the core of Lovecraft's cosmic philosophy. Insignificance is not a mood, but a structural condition. The deeper we peer into the cosmos, the more it refuses to reflect us. The unnamed god enforces this by refusing to be known at all. In stories like The Call of Cthulhu, the terror arises from scale. We live on a placid island of ignorance, Lovecraft writes, in the midst of black seas of infinity. But the god he never describes exceeds even this. It is not hidden in space or time. It is outside structure entirely. It doesn't threaten by arriving, but by being real without context. Unlike Cthulhu, who sleeps beneath the Pacific, or Yog-Sothoth, who exists at all times simultaneously, the unnamed god doesn't fit inside the coordinates of myth. Its presence is philosophical. It asserts that meaning has boundaries, and that beyond those boundaries, only contradiction remains. Entropy, in Lovecraft's world, is not just thermodynamic, it is narrative. Attempts to impose coherence fall apart. Consider The Whisperer in Darkness, where alien beings converse in English and offer seemingly rational explanations, only for the narrator to discover that these surface truths mask a deeper breakdown. The more one learns, the less sense the world makes. This is epistemic entropy, knowledge that dissolves itself. The unnamed god serves as the metaphysical engine of this collapse. It is not chaos in the sense of disorder, but in the sense of anti-pattern, an intelligence or anti-intelligence, so foreign it degrades all interpretation. This extends into Lovecraft's treatment of reality itself. The Dreamlands cycle, especially in the Dream Quest of unknown Kadath, frames reality as conditional. Worlds within worlds, dreams within dreams, and a final god who remains unseen despite being sought. That figure, never described, sits not at the center, but at the edge, implied in the corners of abandoned cities and forgotten landscapes. The implication is unsettling. Reality may itself be a dream, and behind that dream no mind waits, only something watching, disinterested and unreachable. The unnamed god is not the dreamer. It is what dreams are too. We must pause here, because this logic reverses familiar structures. In most metaphysical systems, deeper realities are more unified. Lovecraft offers the opposite. Beneath surface appearances lies not a more coherent order, but a deeper incoherence. The unnamed god is not the source of being. It is what happens when being runs out. This is what separates Lovecraft from both religion and science fiction. He does not offer a world beyond ours, but a collapse of all worlds into an outside that cannot be mapped. The horror is not what we find, but that we are findable by something that doesn't care. Entities like Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth gesture toward this condition, but they retain names, attributes, even implied functions. The unnamed God lacks even that. It is never worshipped, never depicted, never narrated directly. Its absence becomes a kind of signature. It is, in the words of one fictional scholar, a silence within silence. And that silence deforms everything around it. Texts referencing it become unstable. Characters fall into recursive language or go mute. Stories bend around a hole. In this sense, the God does not need to appear. It functions by disfiguring form. This culminates in the idea of epistemic collapse. Forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft is rarely secret information. It is information that undoes understanding. The unnamed God embodies this. To approach it is not to learn, but to lose the ability to make sense. Unlike traditional mysticism, which leads to enlightenment, Lovecraft's silence leads only to fracture. Characters do not transcend, they deteriorate. The God never explained is the pivot point of this process. It ensures that the more one investigates, the less remains intact, of logic, of language, of mind. From here, we turn to the figures that orbit this God's absence. Not mere monsters, but embodiments of partial knowing, entities that reflect its shadow without ever becoming its voice. In the next section, we examine those beings, what they reveal, what they obscure, and how their proximity to the unnamed force reshapes the mythos from within. In Lovecraft's cosmology, most entities are not gods in the traditional sense. They are not defined by omnipotence or morality, but by their resistance to being fully known. Some, like Cthulhu, remain terrifying yet comprehensible. A sleeping titan beneath the sea, venerated by cults and describable in form. Others, like Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth, point beyond comprehension. Yet even these have names, attributes, and functions, keys, gates, centers of chaos. It is the unnamed God, the one never described, that fractures this fragile structure. It is not one among many, but something outside the entire category. The others do not explain it. They orbit its absence. Yog-Sothoth, the all-in-one and one-in-all, is often treated as the embodiment of time and space. In the Dunwich horror, it sires hybrid offspring with a mortal woman, suggesting both proximity and interaction. Yet despite its transcendence, Yog-Sothoth is still invoked, named, and associated with gateways. This implies limitation. A gate implies something beyond. What does Yog-Sothoth gate toward? Lovecraft never says. But the logic of his stories hints that the threshold Yog-Sothoth represents is not the ultimate boundary. It is a perimeter. What lies beyond remains silent. And that silence, by design, is not Yog-Sothoth, but something more final. Azathoth sits at the center of all chaos, gnashing, blind, and mindless, surrounded by a piping chorus. Scholars often interpret Azathoth as the nuclear core of Lovecraft's mythos, raw energy without will. But it, too, has form and metaphor, a throne, a court, a location in the mythic geometry. In the prose poem Azathoth, Lovecraft writes of a man who dreams of reaching a monstrous ultimate void, only to find something more terrible than absence. This suggests a second level. Azathoth may be central, but something watches from outside the center. Again, implication outruns image. Consider Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, often seen as the communicator or messenger among these entities. Nyarlathotep is verbal, active, even mocking. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, he toys with mortals, weaving illusions and breaking minds. If there is an entity in the mythos that understands humanity, it is Nyarlathotep. But his role is defined by mediation. He speaks of others. He does not represent the final truth, but delivers glimpses of it. In this sense, Nyarlathotep acts as a literary device, a bridge between the narratable horror and the unspoken one. What he refuses to say matters more than what he reveals. The dreamlands themselves suggest another route. As explored in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, the gods of the dreamlands are childlike, unknowable, and distant. They abandon Kadath, and Randolph Carter spends the story seeking their presence. When he arrives, they are gone. What remains is Nyarlathotep, and behind him, a suggestion that the being truly ruling the dreamlands is never shown. This absent ruler, never named or described, represents a kind of ultimate witness. It does not create dreams. It is what dreams retreat from. Its nature is not presence, but erasure. This pattern recurs. In The Haunter of the Dark, a being associated with the shining trapezohedron watches from the void. While the haunter is given a name and traits, the gem it emerges from reflects something deeper. The trapezohedron is described as older than Earth, and its light reveals more than is visible. What it doesn't show is what disturbs. The viewer senses something watching through it, but never learns what. The being is a threshold behind which nothing is named. Again, the hierarchy folds inward. The entities become masks, and behind the masks only silence. This layering of presence and absence is not incidental, it is structural. The named entities create scaffolding for something that cannot be described. They function as intermediaries, less like angels and more like insulation. Their role is not to explain, but to limit damage. By naming them, Lovecraft gives the reader a false sense of comprehension. But that sense decays quickly. As one draws closer to the core, or perhaps the edge, things begin to fail. Language breaks, time loops, logic retracts. The unnamed god begins where narrative stops. This section leaves us with a paradox. The mythos is filled with entities, yet defined by a god who is not among them. Its most important figure is not depicted. Instead, it deforms those who try to describe it. In the next section, we turn to the human cost of this contact. Not physical destruction, but madness as collapse of cognitive integrity. The price paid for approaching what cannot be named. Madness in Lovecraft's universe is not a symptom of mental illness, but a rational response to metaphysical violation. Characters do not go mad because they see too much. They go mad because what they see cannot be integrated. The mind collapses, not under horror alone, but under contradiction. This distinction is essential. Cthulhu might terrify, but the unnamed god unravels. Its function is not to frighten the senses, but to undo meaning itself. It does not distort the mind. It reveals that the mind was never adequate to begin with. We see this clearly in The Dreams in the Witch, House. The protagonist, Walter Gilman, encounters angles that defy geometry and beings that traverse dimensions. He attempts to rationalize what he sees through mathematics, but his reason becomes the very tool of his undoing. As the dream reality bleeds into waking life, Gilman's sanity degrades, not from the grotesque, but from the realization that familiar laws no longer apply. Crucially, there is no catharsis, no return to normalcy. He is consumed by a system he cannot model. The unnamed god is not mentioned, but its fingerprints are here, in the space between dimensions, in the silence between thoughts. Consider the recurring pattern. The closer a character comes to ultimate truth, the less coherent they become. In The Call of Cthulhu, Inspector Legrasse and Professor Angel survive their encounters, but the sailor Johansen, who glimpses Cthulhu directly, dies in obscurity after writing a brief and troubled account. His words are fractured, guarded, terrified. The implication is that language cannot bear the weight of what he saw. Now extrapolate this one level higher. If Cthulhu induces such fragmentation, what happens when one nears the entity even the mythos cannot name? Lovecraft offers a clue in the short, elusive text, The Book. It describes a narrator walking endlessly through nighted ruins, each more desolate than the last, until he reaches a presence beyond presence. There is no climax, only a trailing off into fragmented perception. This narrative strategy reveals the function of madness in cosmic horror. It is not delusion, but overload, not disorder, but confrontation with anti-order. The unnamed God does not shatter the mind. It allows the mind to recognize that it was never whole. We must pause here and note the function of language. Madness in these stories often coincides with linguistic failure. Sentences trail into ellipses. Words repeat unnecessarily. Narrators contradict themselves or begin to describe something before abandoning the sentence entirely. This is not stylization. It is thematic content. The closer one gets to the central absence, the more structure itself fails. Thought breaks apart under the strain of contact, not with monstrous form, but with meaninglessness. This is why the god remains unnamed. A name would imply form, and form would allow comprehension. Madness preserves the unknowable by refusing synthesis. There is also a theological subtext to this collapse. In religious traditions, divine encounters often bring madness, but that madness is sanctified. It is treated as a brush with the infinite. In Lovecraft, no such sanctity exists. The madness induced by cosmic contact is hollow. It does not reveal, only consumes. Consider The Shadow Out of Time, where Nathaniel Peaslee exchanges consciousness with an entity of the distant past. Upon returning, he retains fractured memories of alien cities and non-human knowledge. He tries to make sense of them, but they arrive as incoherent flashes, dreams, or compulsions. His sanity is not restored by time. The event remains outside narration. Triadic patterns emerge: exposure, disintegration, silence. Human characters encounter the incomprehensible, fail to reconcile it, and retreat into madness, death, or incomplete testimony. The unnamed god is never shown participating in these moments, but its presence haunts their structure. It is the end point of all inquiry, the final silence behind each broken narrative. Other gods appear, but this one ends appearance. It replaces vision with erasure. In the next section, we will examine this erasure as epistemological threat. How does the mythos treat knowledge itself, not as salvation, but as disease? What happens when inquiry leads not to truth, but to the collapse of truth's possibility? The forbidden knowledge Lovecraft explores is not hidden. It is corrosive. The next step is to trace how that corrosion works and why the unnamed god ensures it can never be reversed. Lovecraft's vision of forbidden knowledge is not about secrecy. It is about collapse. In traditional horror, forbidden knowledge reveals a hidden truth, a vampire's origin, a cult's purpose, a monster's history. In cosmic horror, revelation brings not clarity, but disintegration. The more one understands, the less one can understand. The unnamed god embodies this principle completely. It is not simply unknown, It breaks the act of knowing itself. To seek it is to enter a space where knowledge fails as a category. This is not ignorance. It is epistemic ruin. The Necronomicon, Lovecraft's most infamous fictional text, functions not as a container of answers, but as a vector of decay. Those who read it experience mental collapse, not enlightenment. Its pages contain names, formulas, rituals, but beneath them, a deeper infection. In the Dunwich Horror, Dr. Armitage uses the Necronomicon to stop the creature, but he is already deeply disturbed by what he's learned. The book does not grant control. It merely offers a glimpse into a reality that dissolves causality and logic. The real terror is not what it says, but what it implies cannot be said. We must pause here, because Lovecraft's stories repeatedly stage this kind of collapse, not just personal, but structural. In The Rats in the Walls, a nobleman discovers an ancient subterranean city beneath his ancestral home. Its ruins are not just physical, they are linguistic. Latin, Greek, and older tongues intermingle, becoming unreadable. The protagonist's descent is also a descent into pre-linguistic horror. He begins narrating. He ends making animal sounds. The god is not present, but its function is enacted. What begins in language ends in noise. Rhetorical patterns support this decay. Characters begin with scholarly precision, dates, names, disciplines, but end with hedging, incoherence, or silence. Their voices mirror the collapse of their minds. Consider The Shadow over Innsmouth. The narrator's investigation begins as a civic inquiry and ends in personal transformation. He uncovers the truth about the Deep Ones and their worship of entities like Dagon and Hydra. But the final horror is internal. He is becoming one of them. What he knows has not empowered him. It has rewritten him. This shift from knowledge to mutation exemplifies epistemic collapse. Importantly, forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft is not encoded in symbols waiting to be cracked. It is not a puzzle to be solved. It resists closure. Each new fact leads to greater contradiction. In The Color Out of Space, the entity is neither seen nor understood. It is only described through its effects: decay, madness, infertility. Scientists take samples, but no theory holds. The closer they come to describing it, the less stable their language becomes. The phenomenon withdraws behind every interpretation. This is how the unnamed God operates, not by being discovered, but by unmaking discovery itself. Theologically, this marks a full inversion. Traditional esotericism holds that the deepest truths are hidden but coherent, available through ascension, ritual, or suffering. Lovecraft denies that coherence. There is no deeper order, only greater exposure to disorder. The unnamed God is the endpoint of this philosophy, a being who cannot be known, not because it is too complex, but because it nullifies the act of knowing. It is what remains when interpretation fails, when symbols empty, when words turn inward and collapse. We must ask, what is left when knowledge becomes poison? The answer is silence, madness, or death, but also a peculiar authenticity. Lovecraft's world feels real, not despite its incompleteness, but because of it. The absence of explanation is the explanation. The unnamed God is not merely terrifying, it is necessary. It seals the mythos, ensuring that every question leads to a deeper unknowing. It is not the final answer. It is the reason answers no longer work. From here, we turn to literature itself, to the stories where this absence is felt most directly. How did Lovecraft show what he refused to explain? Which tales come closest to touching the void without collapsing into it? In the next section, we enter those fictions, not for clarity, but to study how narrative itself distorts under the weight of the unspeakable. The earliest hints of the unnamed God appear not in grand declarations, but in narrative absences, scenes that cut away, phrases that trail off, questions that are never asked. In The Nameless City, 1921, Lovecraft writes, "It was of this place that Abdul al-Hazred, the mad poet, dreamed on the night before he sang his unexplained couplet, that is not dead which can eternal lie, slash, and with strange aeons, even death may die." The couplet became central to the mythos, but its source remains shadowed. The unnamed it haunts the phrase. Who lies eternal? Not Cthulhu alone. Something deeper lies beneath that. Deathlessness, something Lovecraft never defines. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, builds on this vagueness. Though Cthulhu is named, described, and even briefly awakened, the story's final line disrupts any sense of closure. The narrator writes, "I shall keep this manuscript for the sake of the warning it conveys, and to this end I will revise and annotate it, if I live." This conditional, "if I live," implies an awareness beyond what has been told. The terror is not that Cthulhu has returned, but that the reality behind Cthulhu remains unspoken. The narrator senses that the god described is not the final horror. It is only a door. In The Dunwich Horror, 1929, the invisible creature that terrorizes the countryside is revealed to be the son of Yog-Sothoth. Yet even Yog-Sothoth, described as a congeries of iridescent globes, serves as a boundary marker, not a source. At the climax, the disembodied voice of the creature cries, "Father, Father, the world's turning dark and I can't see," before dissolving into silence. What follows is not revelation, but further ambiguity. Dr. Armitage speaks vaguely of forces beyond the known, saying only, "No soul of man can look upon them and live." That plural, them, is significant. If Yog-Sothoth is a gate, what lies on the far side? The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, published posthumously, offers the most explicit gesturing toward a hidden divinity. Randolph Carter seeks the majestic city of his dreams, only to be told that the gods of Earth have taken it. When he finally reaches the gods' retreat at Kadath, they are distant, childlike, and ultimately unhelpful. The true antagonist is Nyarlathotep, who taunts Carter and offers veiled insights. But behind even Nyarlathotep lies something else. Carter senses a faint, vast shadow beyond the stars, a force that neither aids nor threatens, only watches. Lovecraft never names it. In doing so, he assigns it greater narrative gravity than any character. We must pause here and examine what this strategy achieves. By refusing to specify the god behind Kadath, Lovecraft reshapes the function of narrative climax. Traditional storytelling builds toward revelation. Dream Quest builds toward erasure. The protagonist gains no final truth, only a recognition that his desire itself was shaped by something unanswerable. The unnamed god, then, is not just a cosmic entity. It is a narrative force that prevents resolution. Its role is to interrupt structure, not complete it. Later stories repeat this maneuver. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1936, the shining trapezohedron serves as a lens to something beyond space. The entity that emerges from it, the Haunter, is terrifying but limited. The real unease comes from what the artifact implies. It's shown darkly, redly, and obscurely, Lovecraft writes, with some inner light that the powers of Earth could not explain. The object suggests observation from something that cannot be described. The Haunter may be the shadow, but not the source. The light reflects an intelligence that remains unnamed. Across these stories, a pattern solidifies. Entities are revealed, named, even confronted, but always with a second, deeper presence implied. This presence has no face, no voice, no myth. It functions as absence made active. By never writing this god directly, Lovecraft paradoxically gives it the most power. The mythos becomes a spiral, with each named entity circling around a center that refuses to appear. In the next section, we turn to how others responded to this void. How did Derleth and later authors try to fill the absence? What did they change, and what was lost in the process? As the mythos expanded, the silence around the unnamed god became harder to maintain, and in that tension, something essential began to shift. One of the clearest confrontations with the boundaries of knowledge in Lovecraft's work occurs in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. This story, often dismissed for its fantasy elements, is in fact a precise staging of Lovecraft's central philosophical dilemma. What happens when desire confronts the unknowable? Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's recurring dreamer and surrogate, seeks a vision that has haunted his dreams, a majestic city bathed in twilight. His journey spans multiple dimensions, strange landscapes, and alien races. Yet the story resists narrative satisfaction. At each turn, Carter is warned not to seek the gods of dream. He persists. What he finds is silence. The gods, when encountered, are childlike and ineffectual. They are not terrifying. They are irrelevant. The real antagonist is Nyarlathotep, who confronts Carter with the fact that the city he seeks is his own idealized memory of Boston. This revelation is not a comfort. It is a trap. The gods of dream fled the city because it belonged not to them, but to Carter. Their absence suggests displacement. The city was taken by a force neither Carter nor the reader can name. Nyarlathotep taunts him, "You are not made to understand. There is a gulf." That gulf, between dream and reality, between desire and truth, is the unnamed god's domain. We must pause here. The entire narrative builds toward a god who never appears. Unlike other Lovecraftian entities, this one is not glimpsed, described, or summoned. It is felt in the withdrawal of all other powers. Carter's search fails not because he is punished, but because his goal was never accessible. The story ends with a return, not to safety, but to ambiguity. This is the function of the unnamed god, to render all quests recursive, to turn the seeker back upon himself. The horror is not what is found, but that nothing can be. The narrative technique reflects this philosophy. Dream Quest is episodic, non-linear, and filled with digressions. Encounters with ghouls, zoogs, and moon beasts create a sense of scale, but never progression. The closer Carter gets to Kadath, the less coherent the world becomes. The climax, if it can be called that, is a confrontation with a figure who provides riddles, not answers. The city remains distant, and its governing power unnamed. The story dissolves into dream logic. In this way, Lovecraft turns plot into epistemology. The journey is not through space, but through the failure of structure. Literary comparison sharpens this effect. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the pilgrim ascends through ordered realms to confront the divine. In Dream Quest, Carter descends into a world with no center. The final vision is not God, but a reminder that the gods themselves fled. The absence is not punishment, it is architecture. Where Dante ends with beatific vision, Lovecraft ends with denial of vision. The unnamed god is not hidden behind Nyarlathotep. It is what cannot be placed in any system. Crucially, this erasure affects Carter's identity. He begins as a confident seeker of truth, equipped with curiosity and courage. He ends, diminished, his memories unstable, his achievements unclear. He does not return stronger. He returns redirected. The story denies transcendence. What Carter sought is folded back into himself, never clarified. The god's absence ensures that the self remains unknowable. This is not character development, it is narrative disintegration. This case study shows how Lovecraft used fiction not to tell stories, but to simulate philosophical collapse. Dream Quest does not fail as a story. It refuses story as form. The unnamed god ensures this refusal remains complete. Its presence is not in scenes or lines, but in everything left undone. From here, we turn to a second case, the Haunter of the Dark, where the god's silence is felt not through dreams, but through light, stone, and death. Another kind of contact. Another kind of erasure. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1936, Lovecraft offers one of his most refined demonstrations of cosmic absence. Unlike Dream Quest, which operates in the surreal logic of dreams, this tale is grounded in physical space. A decaying church in Providence, a forbidden artifact, and a young man named Robert Blake who dies under mysterious circumstances. Yet behind the material details, the same architectural silence prevails. The being glimpsed through the shining trapezohedron, referred to only as the Haunter, serves as an intermediary. It terrifies, but it also conceals. What watches through it is never named. The trapezohedron is described as a window on all time and space, older than Earth, and capable of summoning a thing from the stars when exposed to darkness. This object is more than a relic. It is a threshold device. In the story's most revealing passage, Lovecraft writes, "It shone with a dark light that obscured rather than revealed." The contradiction is deliberate. The artifact illuminates nothing. Instead, it attracts attention from the other side. What that other side holds is never specified. The Biuki, Haunter, is not its master, but its signal. The reader is left with a lingering impression. Something looked back, and the act of looking was fatal. Blake's descent into obsession mirrors the typical Lovecraftian arc. Intellectual curiosity leads to forbidden contact, and contact leads to collapse. But unlike earlier tales, Blake's final thoughts are fragmentary and terrified. He writes in his journal, "I see it, coming here, Hellwind, Titan blur, black wings, Yog-Sothoth, save me, the three-lobed burning eye." Then nothing. The phrase, three-lobed burning eye, is never explained. It has no context, no follow-up, and no symbolic decoding. It is not part of the known mythos taxonomy. This absence marks it. The phrase becomes a sigil for the unnamed god, appearing only when meaning dissolves. We must pause here. The story is structured around thresholds, light and dark, inside and outside, seen and unseen. But none of these oppositions resolve. The Haunter moves only in darkness, but the darkness reveals nothing. The trapezohedron opens vision, but vision obscures. Blake's role is not to solve a mystery, but to document its failure. The closer he comes to insight, the more unstable his observations become. The unnamed god is not shown, but its presence saturates the air around the story's final silence. There is no redemption in this tale, no heroic resistance. The church that houses the artifact is long abandoned, its cult dissolved, its records fragmented. The object persists, and with it, the implication of something deeper. The Haunter can be seen, what uses it cannot. This separation is key. The god never explained operates through avatars like the Haunter, never as them. Its power lies in the fact that it is never confused with what appears. It withholds appearance absolutely. The theological implications are severe. In most traditions, sacred relics reveal divine presence through miracles, symbols, or metaphysical insights. The trapezohedron does the opposite. It reveals too much without meaning. It is not a symbol. It is a rupture. Lovecraft provides no origin, no creator, no purpose. The object exists to attract the attention of something whose existence cannot be shaped into story. It generates narrative, then annihilates it. The function of the haunter of the dark within the mythos is to reinforce this structural absence. Even with named horrors, even with visible deaths, the central terror remains invisible. The story is short, focused, and economical, but the God it points to is vast, withheld, and impossible. The result is not narrative satisfaction, but philosophical unease, something watched and we were not meant to know it. In the next section, we examine how later writers attempted to name what Lovecraft refused to. Their efforts to resolve the mythos, through dualism, taxonomy, or expansion, reveal how fragile his silence truly was. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, his mythos did not die, it calcified. August Derleth, the chief architect of its posthumous expansion, sought not ambiguity, but order. He reframed Lovecraft's pantheon into a theological dualism. The great old ones were now evil, chaotic, aligned with elemental forces, while the elder gods stood as cosmic counterweights, benevolent, lawful, and ultimately victorious. In this new structure, even Azathoth became a pawn of balance, but the cost of systematization was immense. The god Lovecraft never explained. The absent, unnameable, ontologically disruptive presence was either ignored or diluted into a role within a larger cosmic bureaucracy. The rupture became a placeholder. Derleth's reinterpretation imposed a taxonomy that Lovecraft actively resisted. He assigned elemental classifications, earth, air, fire, water, to entities that had never operated within such frameworks. He named new gods that mirrored Christian archangels. And most significantly, he imagined a moral battle among cosmic forces, a war in which the good elder gods could be invoked to banish the malign. This removed the foundational horror from Lovecraft's work. The unknown was no longer unknowable. It simply waited to be charted. The god never named had no place in this schema. It could not be listed in a pantheon. It could not serve a side. Other authors followed, but some resisted this closure. Ramsey Campbell introduced entities that echoed Lovecraft's linguistic strategies, names like Yigolonak or Daoloth that implied form but resisted clear symbolism. Yet even these often came with backstories, cults, geographies. The silence weakened. It was no longer an existential abyss, but a stylistic gesture. To name was once a failure. Now it became a feature. The unnamed god faded, not by being forgotten, but by being overwritten with too many lesser names. Thomas Ligotti, writing decades later, reversed this trend. In stories like The Last Feast of Harlequin and The Shadow at the Bottom of the World, he returned to Lovecraft's core move, suggesting a reality that dissolves all frameworks. Ligotti avoids naming his forces. He implies a presence that watches through carnival masks, fungal blooms, or rural festivals, never directly described, never tied to a stable mythos. His horror, like Lovecraft's most profound, rests on cognitive fragility. The unnamed returns, not as a being, but as an effect. Its influence is measured by what it unravels. We must pause here. Because what is being preserved in these later works is not a creature or concept, it is a strategy. Lovecraft's decision not to name the god was not a gap to be filled. It was a technique, a formal device to preserve the horror of scale and the terror of collapse. Attempts to expand the mythos often misunderstand this. By fleshing out the cosmology, they reduce its potency. The God never explained is not waiting for elaboration. It is the refusal to elaborate. In visual media, the pressure to represent accelerates this loss. Films and games often interpret Lovecraftian entities as tentacled monsters, vast and alien, but always visible. Bloodborne and the Call of Cthulhu, 2018 game, invoke Eldritch aesthetics but assign stats, behaviors, and visual cues. The unnamed god cannot survive such treatment. To model it is to erase it. Its power lies not in spectacle, but in unavailability. It is not a final boss. It is the blank space on the map. And yet, something lingers. Despite expansions, adaptations, and reinterpretations, the gravitational pull of the unnamed god remains. Readers notice what is not said. They sense the unease that comes not from revelation, but from its denial. That is Lovecraft's lasting contribution, not a shared universe, but a shared absence. A structure haunted by something that destabilizes every story it touches. The mythos, then, is not a canon. It is a field of failure. Each story attempts to speak the unspeakable. Some come close, most collapse. And, at the center, never written, never shown, waits the one God Lovecraft never explained. What remains is to ask how that absence survives today. In culture, in myth, in the fractured reflections of belief and madness. We turn now to its afterlife. The God Lovecraft never explained has, paradoxically, endured through what it never became: a story, a name, a fixed idea. In online forums, anonymous posts, and whispered ARGs, the blank space at the center of his mythos has taken on new life, not as canon, but as contagion. Urban legends speak of the true name Lovecraft wouldn't write, with claims of censored manuscripts, redacted pages, or dream records where the name appears and is instantly forgotten. These fictions are not Lovecraftian pastiches. They are imitations of his silence. The god survives not through representation, but through recurrence. It emerges wherever language fails to hold. One enduring hoax from the early 2000s involved a supposed missing Necronomicon passage shared across occult message boards. The excerpt described a dream in which a name is spoken, then erased from the dreamer's memory, leaving only a sensation of being watched. The passage was unsigned, unverifiable, and circulated in screenshot form, but its impact was real. Users reported dreams of the word without echo, or moments of unease triggered by the phrase, "that which the old ones forgot." Whether invented or believed, the story shows the same principle. Absence amplifies. When meaning recedes, interpretation multiplies. In gaming and film, attempts to depict Lovecraftian horror often default to scale and spectacle. But some creators preserve the core principle of the unnameable god. In The Endless, 2017, the characters confront a being never seen, whose power lies in creating loops, fragmenting time, and generating worship through confusion. The entity is never described, only inferred through spatial impossibilities and narrative repetition. Similarly, Annihilation, 2018, avoids naming its central force. It warps DNA, refracts memory, and absorbs identity, but never declares intent. The audience, like the characters, must interpret effects without accessing cause. The silence is the message. Even music carries this resonance. In dark ambient and drone genres, Artists like Lust Mord and Atrium Carceri create sonic spaces that evoke non-place and non-being. These are not songs about gods. They are attempts to sound like something watching. Titles reference thresholds, descent, or the watchers behind the veil, but the tracks themselves are built from dissonance, absence of rhythm, and frequencies just above hearing. Here, Lovecraft's strategy becomes a compositional tool. Evoke without resolving, gesture without landing. The unnamed god becomes a tonal presence, implied by what is not said, not played, not resolved. Academically and philosophically, the idea has also gained traction. Post-structuralist thinkers, Derrida, Bataille, Lyotard, echo Lovecraft's suspicion of total systems. They write of gaps, ruptures, and unknowables at the heart of meaning. Some scholars have linked Lovecraft's godless cosmos to negative theology, the via negativa that defines God only by what he is not. But Lovecraft's version contains no divinity, no promise. His negative theology leads not to sublimity, but to epistemic ruin. That idea resonates with a postmodern world where institutions fail, narratives collapse, and truth itself appears unstable. The unnamed God is the void behind consensus. We must pause here. Why does this figure, never written, never seen, persist so powerfully? The answer may lie in its refusal to close. Most horror resolves. The monster is killed, the curse broken, the secret buried. But Lovecraft's God resists all closure. It mirrors a deeper human anxiety, that there is no final answer. That meaning, once pushed far enough, decays. The God becomes a mirror of our own investigations, a shape made of failure. It persists because it offers nothing to hold on to, and yet cannot be let go. In the end, the God Lovecraft, never explained, functions less like a character and more like a condition. It appears in our myths, our culture, our gaps, not through presence, but through distortion. It marks where knowledge turns back, where certainty cracks. Its power lies not in what it does, but in what it makes impossible. As long as we search for meaning and fear its absence, that God will remain, not in stories, but in the structures those stories cannot complete. The final horror is not that something waits in the dark. The final horror is that something does, and we will never know what. The visual media landscape has long struggled with Lovecraft's fundamental contradiction. How do you portray something defined by its refusal to be portrayed? Most adaptations fail by trying to show too much, rendering indescribable horrors as tentacled beasts or cosmic storms. Yet a handful of films and games have approached the unnamed God not by illustrating it, but by embracing its structural absence. These works succeed not through revelation, but through withdrawal. They reframe horror not as spectacle, but as epistemological rupture. In The Endless, 2017, a cult trapped in repeating time loops worships an unseen entity. The being never appears, but its influence is unmistakable. Distorted causality, emotional manipulation, and recursive deaths. The characters attempt escape, but the entity allows only repetition. The horror lies in the implications. It watches, it remembers, it controls time, but it has no voice, no form. It offers no reason for its actions. The audience is denied a mythology. This denial is deliberate. The film functions like a Lovecraftian narrative stripped of language, where silence signals power. In games like Darkest Dungeon, the unnamed god's influence is refracted through descent and decay. The Ancestor, the game's narrator, speaks of opening portals and summoning the thing without shape, yet no final confrontation provides clarity. Instead, players experience entropy. madness, mutation, and linguistic fragmentation. The narrator's final words confess that even death may die, but what that means is left to interpretation. The god remains off-stage, unvoiced, yet its presence saturates every moment. The structure collapses inward, mirroring Lovecraft's refusal to conclude. Bloodborne, 2015, presents a more complex case. Its great ones are visible, monstrous, and influential, but never explained. Players learn of a being called the Moon Presence, whose goals and origins remain opaque. Unlike traditional antagonists, it does not speak, threaten, or gloat. It merely watches and waits. The game hints that all human knowledge, from healing to religion, has been corrupted by contact with forces that cannot be grasped. In one of the game's endings, the player character becomes an inhuman larval god, not in triumph, but in transformation. This inversion of transcendence echoes Lovecraft's idea of forbidden knowledge. It does not enlighten, it mutates. We must pause here. The unnamed god's cultural legacy is most successful where form itself breaks. Horror soundtracks composed of droning dissonance, interactive narratives that refuse resolution, films that collapse into circular time or ontological ambiguity. These are not pastiches, they are structural homages. They understand what Lovecraft knew, that the most terrifying god is not seen, but felt in the failure of understanding. Even in literature, this influence lingers. Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves structures its horror around a house larger on the inside than the outside. The deeper one descends, the less form remains. There is no monster, only endless corridors, whispers in the dark, and a suggestion that something watches. The void is narrative. The terror is architectural. The unnamed god is not mentioned, but its logic governs every page. In these works, Lovecraft's silence becomes a method. The god never described is not absent. It has become form itself. Wherever resolution fails, wherever narrative collapses under the weight of implication, it lives. It does not need cults or sigils. It needs only the refusal to explain. The question is no longer, what is it, but why can't we know? And that question continues. Every attempt to adapt Lovecraft becomes a confrontation with his deepest refusal. The unnamed god is not an aesthetic. It's a structural device, a limit case. It persists not because creators depict it well, but because they fail to. And in that failure, something larger begins to speak. Or rather, not speak at all. Within academic circles and subcultures, the god Lovecraft never explained has taken on a second life. Not as a character, but as a metaphor. It has become a placeholder for the unrepresentable, a model for ideas that resist closure, systematization, and authority. Scholars across disciplines, philosophy, theology, literature, even political theory, have found in Lovecraft's silence a compelling analog for the limits of knowledge, the void beneath meaning, and the terror of conceptual collapse. The god functions less like a literary invention and more like a philosophical condition. Post-structuralist thinkers were among the first to notice this resonance. Michel Foucault's The Order of Things begins with an epigraph from Borges, describing a taxonomy in which it is not possible to think. This idea that structures can exist beyond thought is deeply Lovecraftian. Jacques Derrida's notion of différance, the endless deferral of meaning, echoes the unnamed god's function. The more one seeks it, the more meaning unravels. It does not anchor interpretation. It undoes it. In this reading, Lovecraft's silence becomes a methodological gesture, a way of signaling the moment when discourse fails. In subcultures, this failure has become an aesthetic. The online weird fiction revival, liminal horror forums, and analog horror creators have embraced Lovecraft's approach, not by invoking Cthulhu, but by replicating the structure of his omissions. Projects like Gemini Home Entertainment and Local 58 hint at vast inhuman systems whose goals remain unexplained. These narratives do not build lore, they resist it. Viewers report a consistent effect. They feel watched, but cannot say by what. The unnamed God's presence is not declared, it is intuited through the instability of form. Music scenes have responded similarly. Some black metal and dark ambient artists refer to the Great Silence or the God behind the veil, drawing on Lovecraftian language without naming specific entities. These works are not worshipful, they are confrontational. The goal is not to honor a being, but to evoke its gaze. In these performances, the god becomes a symbol of creative negation, that which cannot be named, yet which defines the field. We must pause here. The god's cultural afterlife reveals something essential. It persists not by being understood, but by becoming usable. In academia, it models the impossibility of closure. In subcultures, it marks a boundary between expression and collapse. In both, it functions as a rupture, something that breaks systems without replacing them. Unlike most mythological figures, it invites no devotion. It demands no belief. It simply undoes. Even in political theory, traces of this idea appear. Some theorists describe systemic violence, ecological crisis, or late capitalism using Lovecraftian metaphors, impersonal forces too vast to confront, too complex to narrate. The unnamed God becomes a way of thinking about abstraction without agency. It is not evil, it is indifferent, but its scale makes resistance meaningless. This shift, from creature to concept, marks the god's true legacy. What remains is a kind of intellectual haunting. The god is never cited directly in papers or manifestos, but its shape lingers. It appears wherever frameworks tremble, wherever knowledge ends in silence, wherever systems reveal their own fragility. The mythos it haunts is no longer just literary. It is cultural, philosophical, and psychological. In this sense, Lovecraft's silence has spoken more than any myth ever could. And yet, what it means remains unreachable. The next and final step is to examine that unreachability, not just as theme, but as psychological condition. What happens when the unknowable becomes part of everyday thought? What does it mean to live with the absence Lovecraft made visible? We turn now to the lasting internal trace, the god as idea and the mind as its witness. The god Lovecraft never explained endures not as mythology, but as psychological residue. It lives in what we cannot resolve, what we fear to ask, what thought itself cannot contain. Unlike monsters that lurch, from shadows or spirits that whisper in abandoned halls, this god functions without appearing. It operates not through presence, but through implication. And that implication, once internalized, changes how we think. It introduces a condition, not of fear, but of irreparable unease. The concept persists because it speaks to a universal anxiety, that reality may be structured by something fundamentally indifferent to thought, to language, to us. In traditional religion, the divine gives purpose. In most horror, even malevolent forces offer meaning. They punish, pursue, or corrupt. But the unnamed God does none of these. It does not speak. It does not act. It is there, and that is enough. The human mind, trained to find pattern, recoils at patternlessness. This is not terror. It is the slow ache of existential dislocation. Psychologically, this evokes what some theorists call ontological insecurity, a sense that the ground beneath one's reality has shifted. It is not trauma in the usual sense. Nothing happens. No one dies. Instead, the very structure of understanding phrase. Consider the final line of The Shadow Out of Time, where the narrator says, "I shiver at the thought of what may still be brooding down there." He refers to the ancient vaults of a pre-human civilization, but the statement lingers because he doesn't know what. The horror is not evental. It is architectural. The mind cannot seal the space it has opened. In this way, the unnamed God becomes less a figure than a phenomenon. It is the sensation of scale without anchor, of knowledge stripped of purpose, of meaning eroded by its own expansion. This is why it cannot be resolved in plot or named in doctrine. It represents a limit, and once glimpsed, even partially, it cannot be unseen. The reader, like the character, becomes marked, not possessed, not cursed, just aware. And awareness here is the wound. This may explain its longevity across generations. Other literary horrors fade as styles change. Vampires evolve. Ghosts modernize. But the unnamed God persists because it was never tethered to culture. It was never of time. It was a literary enactment of timeless absence. As long as we seek ultimate answers and fear that none exist, its silence will remain. It is not waiting. It is not sleeping. It simply is, and that is the terror. We must pause here, because this does not mean nihilism. Lovecraft's vision is often mistaken for despair, but the unnamed God does not suggest that nothing matters. It suggests that meaning, if it exists, is not ours to access. That is a different kind of weight. It does not crush the mind. It decouples it. The horror is not that the universe is empty, but that it may be full of something that refuses to be understood. Not cruelty, but refusal. Not punishment, but disregard. And that is where we end, not with conclusion, but with continued tension. The God Lovecraft never explained remains unexplained. That is its function. That is its gift. It is the horror that outlives narrative, that slips between questions, that sits where language stops. We can study its echoes, trace its shadows, speculate on its origin. But the closer we draw, the more it retreats, not because it hides, but because it cannot be found. And so, it waits, in margins, in silences, in the spaces we avoid, watching, not us, perhaps, just watching.